French Revolution, an event that changed the course of world history, it was a time of upheaval, rebellion, and transformation. But have you ever wondered, why did it happen in the first place? What caused ordinary people to rise up against a powerful monarchy that had ruled for centuries? In this video, we're going to dig deep into the causes of the French Revolution, from social inequality to financial ruin, from revolutionary ideas to the impact of famine. This story is more than just a revolt against a king. It's a story of frustration, hope, and the desire for change. So grab a drink, settle in, and let's dive into the fascinating history of why the French Revolution happened. To understand the French Revolution, we first need to understand France under the Ancien Régime, also known as the Old Regime. It was a society of stark divisions, with rigid social classes that seemed unchangeable. If you were born into wealth and privilege, life was comfortable. But for most people, the reality was far different. Let's break down the social structure. At the very top was the king, in this case Louis XVI. He ruled with absolute power, believing that he was chosen by God to lead the people. Below him were the First Estate and the Second Estate, two small but incredibly powerful groups. The First Estate consisted of the clergy, church officials who controlled much of the land and wealth. The church held immense influence, both spiritually and economically. They owned around 10% of the land and collected tithes, yet they were exempt from most taxes. Can you imagine? The wealthiest landowners paying little to no taxes? The Second Estate was made up of the nobility, the lords and ladies who lived in grand estates, often in luxury and excess. They held important positions in the government, military, and courts. And like the clergy, they also enjoyed special privileges, including exemptions from taxes. But the majority of the population, around 98%, belonged to the Third Estate. This estate was a mix of different social classes, from the bourgeoisie, or middle class, to the urban workers and the peasants. The bourgeoisie were merchants, professionals, and business owners, people who had wealth but little political power. The urban workers, on the other hand, often faced hard labor in the cities, working in industries like textiles or construction. And then, at the very bottom, were the peasants who toiled away on the land, barely scraping by. Imagine being part of this majority, struggling to make ends meet while watching the elite live in luxury. It wasn't just about money, it was about feeling trapped in a system that offered no opportunities for change. If you were a peasant or an urban worker, your daily life was filled with hard work, poor living conditions, and heavy taxes. And remember, the clergy and nobility didn't have to pay these taxes. Instead, it was the Third Estate that carried the burden of supporting the kingdom. Think about it. You're working endlessly just to survive, while the rich are enjoying lives of leisure, exempt from the very taxes that are breaking your back. You would feel angry, right? And this anger started to build up. The peasants were tired of being exploited, and the bourgeoisie wanted more political influence. This was the first crack in the foundation of the old regime. But what really lit the fuse was a combination of economic hardship and a financial crisis. By the late 1700s, France's financial situation was dire. The kingdom was in massive debt. How did it get there? Well, there were several key reasons. First, the monarchy's extravagant spending. Take the Palace of Versailles, for example. King Louis XVI and his predecessors spent vast sums on lavish court life, grand banquets, and expensive ceremonies. The Queen, Marie Antoinette in particular, became infamous for her extravagant lifestyle. Though it's often exaggerated, her spending was a symbol of the excesses of the royal family. But it wasn't just the monarchy's spending habits that drained the treasury. France had been involved in several costly wars, most notably the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. France had supported the American colonies in their fight against Britain, pouring money and resources into the effort. While they may have gained an ally in the U.S., the cost was enormous. France was left with crippling debt and little to show for it. To make matters worse, in the years leading up to the Revolution, France experienced several bad harvests. Crops failed, food prices soared, and famine swept through the countryside. Bread, which was the staple food for most people, became scarce and expensive. Imagine trying to feed your family when the price of bread tripled. Hunger leads to desperation, and the people were becoming increasingly desperate. The king's finance ministers suggested several reforms to solve the financial crisis. Some proposed taxing the nobility and clergy, a move that would have eased the burden on the Third Estate. But these ideas were blocked at every turn. The nobility, of course, didn't want to lose their privileges, and the king lacked the political will to push these reforms through. The financial crisis wasn't just about numbers. It was about survival. People couldn't afford basic necessities. Bread riots broke out in the cities, and resentment towards the ruling class grew. There was a sense that the government was failing to address the people's needs. The frustration of the Third Estate was about to boil over. But there was one more important ingredient in this revolutionary recipe: new ideas. And these ideas came from a movement we now call the Enlightenment. Let's talk about the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement that spread across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu began to question the traditional structures of power and authority. The Enlightenment was all about reason, logic, and individual rights. It challenged the idea of absolute monarchy, where the king ruled by divine right. Instead, these philosophers argued that governments should be based on consent of the governed, that rulers should be accountable to the people, not the other way around. One of the most influential figures was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that sovereignty belonged to the people, not the king. In his book, The Social Contract, he proposed the idea of popular sovereignty, where the general will of the people should guide government decisions. This was revolutionary thinking at the time. These ideas didn't just stay in books or salons. They spread like wildfire. The bourgeoisie, in particular, were drawn to Enlightenment ideals. They were educated, they had wealth, but they lacked political power. The ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity resonated deeply with them. They began to imagine a society where they could have a say in the government, where rights were protected, and where the old hierarchical system could be challenged. These ideas sparked hope for a better future. The Enlightenment provided a framework for thinking about rights, justice, and governance. People began to question why the king and the nobility held all the power. Why should a small group of elites control the fate of millions? Why should the Third Estate, which made up the majority of the population, have no voice in how the country was run? The Enlightenment wasn't just an intellectual movement. It was a call for action. By 1789, France was on the brink. The financial crisis, social inequality, and growing unrest pushed the monarchy into a corner. In a last-ditch effort to solve the crisis, King Louis XVI called for a meeting of the Estates General, a general assembly where representatives from all three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate, would come together to discuss the kingdom's problems. This was a big deal. The Estates General hadn't been called in over 150 years. The Third Estate saw this as an opportunity to finally demand change. They came to the meeting with a list of grievances: fairer taxes, more political representation, and an end to the privileges of the nobility. It was their chance to reshape the system. But as you might have guessed, things didn't go as planned. The meeting quickly turned sour. The Third Estate was sidelined, their demands ignored by the king and the nobility. The frustration that had been simmering for years finally reached a breaking point. In a bold move, the representatives of the Third Estate broke away and declared themselves the National Assembly, vowing to create a new constitution for France. This was an act of open defiance. It was the spark that would ignite the flames of revolution. Soon after, the famous storming of the Bastille took place on July 14, 1789, a moment that symbolized the people's rejection of the king's absolute power and the beginning of the revolution. So, why did the French Revolution happen? It wasn't just one cause. It was a perfect storm of factors: deep social inequality, financial mismanagement, and the rise of new ideas all contributed to the growing unrest. The French people had had enough of living under a system that oppressed them while benefiting the few. And when they were given the chance to act, they seized it. The French Revolution would go on to reshape not only France, but the world, spreading ideas of democracy and human rights that still resonate today. It was a moment when ordinary people stood up and said, "Enough." And that's why the French Revolution happened. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the biggest factor leading to the revolution? Let's continue the conversation.